Hi guys, okay, so what we're going to focus on today is youth and deviance. So a lot of what we've covered before has linked youth to deviance already. So for example, the skinheads were deviant, teddy boys were deviant, but this is just to kind of make sure that if a whole question came up on it, you would know what to do. And really, you don't need to focus too much of your energies on it because it did come up last year. However, you never know, it could come up again, so it's just important to make sure that we cover ourselves. So to start off with, we're going to look at what deviance is. So as you already know, it's behaviour which goes against the norms and values of society. And what's important to understand is under deviance, there includes juvenile crime and juvenile delinquency. So as it says here, juvenile crime is when young people break the law. So this is things like crimes such as vandalism and joyriding, and they're more likely to be committed by youth. Whereas juvenile delinquency is disruption caused by young people. So the key word here is disruption. And as it says, this includes serious crimes such as rioting, burglary, but it also includes little things like kind of non-criminal behaviour, so things like being cheeky or truanting from school. And what's important to also know is that when we look at official statistics, so official crime statistics, most criminals are male, young, working class, and live in urban areas, so things like cities. So although we're looking at youth, it's important to understand that the type of youth we're looking at are more likely to be male, working class, and living in urban areas. So we're now going to look at some theories to explain why these are the type of criminals that we have. So to start off with, we have the functionalist subcultural explanations of crime. So it's important to understand that a functionalist subcultural explanation is different to a normal functionalist explanation. So the only thing really that's different between these is the fact that functionalists are kind of written a long time ago, whereas functionalist subcultural look at groups. They acknowledge different groups within society, whereas normal functionalists look at all youth as a whole, whereas functionalist subcultural theories tend to have a look predominantly at working class youth. So they look at why it is that working class youth are more likely to turn to crime. But the thing that makes them functionalist is they acknowledge that everybody shares the same norms and values. So they think that everybody in society shares the same norms and values. The working class can't achieve those norms and values, and therefore they might end up turning to crime. So we're going to start off with Merton. So Merton says that there is a theory called the strain theory, and he believes that everybody in society has goals and means. And he describes goals as something that in culture encourages you to achieve. So within the UK, that might be things like having a nice house, having a nice car, all those kind of things that are expected of you. So maybe going to university, having kind of monetary goals, which tend to be achieved through going to through the education system and getting a job and things like that. And they are the means. So the goal is the things like having lots of money and having a nice car and a nice house, whereas the means are things like doing so by getting a job or getting an education. So what Merton says is that when people have a disparity between the goals and the means, so basically, I suppose a difference between the goals and the means, this is when strain occurs. So this is the idea that if everybody wants to have money within society, but people can't get a good job or they can't get a good education, then they feel strain. And as a result of this strain, they might end up, I suppose, creating new means which will mean that they can achieve those goals. So the person or the type of people who are more likely to fail in education, as you know, are working classes. So as a result, the working classes fail in education, they then don't get a good job, they then feel that they can't have all the kind of means to achieve the monetary goals, and then this leads to strain. When they feel this strain, they then turn to what we call different subcultural values as a way to try and, I suppose, eliminate this strain. So we're just going to show this on the next slide. So when there's anomie, This is when an individual cannot achieve the goals set by society. So that's kind of linking to the idea of not having the means. So not having the means. And then this leads to frustration, and they cope with it in different ways. So on page 59 in your textbook, there are 5 adaptations to strain, which are in bullet points. So I'll just give you a couple of minutes to pause this YouTube clip and write down the 5 ways in which subcultures cope with anime. And then what I'll do is I'll explain it in the next slide. But if you want to pause it, have a little look for yourself, try and understand it, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so hopefully you understood those. So to start off with, there's retreatism. So this is where individuals completely give up on their goals and their means. So they give up on the goals of society. So remember, the goals are always monetary. They then also give up the means. So this is where they just completely retreat or take themselves away from society. So things like alcoholism. So it's not a mainstream goal of society to be an alcoholic. And so as a result, they'll sit on the street, not work because they haven't got a job, they won't have a good education, so they don't have the means, but then they don't have any goals to have a nice house or a big car. So they just kind of retreat from society. The other and most common way in which people deal with strain is they accept the goals, so they still want lots and lots of money, but they reject the conventional means. So this is where they might turn to things like drug dealing. So innovation is what happens a lot when people want to achieve monetary goals but can't do it through conventional means, such as getting a job or an education. The next one is rebellion, which is where they actually just completely give up on the goals and the means, similar to retreatism, but they create new ones. So things like terrorism. So for example, some people who are terrorists are taught that what they will be rewarded with bombing a building or whatever, they'll be rewarded with 72 virgins in heaven. Apparently that's something which is a goal that they would like. And the means in which they're going to do so is by blowing something up. So they're completely new goals and completely new means of society. And this is, again, obviously going to link to crime. Conformity is actually not a criminal adaptation to strain. This is what most people do in society. So they accept the goals, they accept the means to try and get a job, buy a house, a car. So this is what's quite good about Merton's strain theory. It does acknowledge that not everybody turns to crime. Only some people turn to crime. Some people conform, so they have a job, they want to get a nice house and a nice car and that kind of stuff, regardless of their social class. Whereas some people do one of these other things, so they retreat or they innovate or they rebel. And then the other one, which is a kind of non-criminal response to strain. So both of these are non-criminal. Is ritualism, which is what we mean by going through the motions. So they go to work, they don't break the law, but they kind of lose sight of their goals. So they just turn up to work to make ends meet. So you've got a house, you've got a car, you haven't really got anything else to look forward to. So you just kind of turn up, do your thing. And this is more likely to happen in adults. It's very likely that adults are more likely to go through ritualism and conformity. But young people who want the goals of society, so to have a nice house, a nice car, an iPod, latest trainers, nice clothes, might end up turning to innovation, so a criminal response to their strain. They might rebel, so they might turn to terrorism, which is obviously less likely, or they might retreat and just give up on everything, which is less likely than innovation, but it is still more likely, I think, than rebellion. So what I'd like you to have a go at is this table. So this is probably quite good to have in your notes because it's just a nice visual way of what the different adaptations to strain are. So what this kind of code means is if it's got a plus sign, then that's the code for the adaptation to strain, accepting the goals and accepting the means. So to start off with, just to give you an example, this one would be conformity. Sorry, my pen's not working properly. So conformity, because they accept the goals of society and they accept the means in which to do so. So if you go through, this one is accepting the goals but rejecting the means, and then this is rejecting the goal and accepting the means, etc., etc. And the code's just down here. So if you just spend a minute or so trying to write this and guess which one's which, and then I'll go through the answers. Okay, so the next one, where you accept the goal but you reject the means, this would be innovation, because you want to have the nice house and the nice car, but you don't do it through legitimate means, so you reject it. The next one is where you reject the goals but you accept the means, and that would be ritualism, which is where you give up on your goals in life. You just kind of, plod along, keep going through, but you still kind of conform to the mainstream means of society. The next one is you reject the goals and you reject the means. So this is where you retreat. And then the final one is rebellion, because you create your own new goals and own new means. So the key with this is that with Merton's strain theory, you're more likely to turn to innovation and potentially, I suppose, retreatism and rebellion, maybe retreatism more so, in your youth. So where you turn to alcoholism, drugs, that kind of thing. So you might have subcultures like hippies might be more likely to do something like that. Whereas with innovation, you might obviously have some kind of new, way of achieving your goals. So that might be through turning to gang crime and going and stealing loads of stuff, or drug dealing. And then there's also rebellion, which would potentially be more likely to be sort of your punks. So their new goals are to kind of rebel against the system, and their means in which to do so is through punk music, for example. So the next one is Albert Cohen. So we've talked about Albert Cohen before, but I just want to make sure that you're clear on it. So it's the idea of status frustration. So it's the idea that young people often feel frustrated because of the fact that they don't have as much status as older people within society. So as a result of feeling this status frustration, they might turn to crime or deviance as a way to achieve that. So, as it says here, status frustration is when someone cannot achieve status in a traditional way, they become frustrated, and so they cope with this strain by forming an alternative status hierarchy. So what that means is, if you think of a normal hierarchy, the sort of top of the hierarchy might be something like, doctors or lawyers, and then people who are at the bottom of the hierarchy might be kind of people on benefits, for example. So if you are frustrated with your social situation because you're not powerful, you're kind of not really in this hierarchy yet, you create an alternative status hierarchy. So within your group, you might have more status for being the person that is the hardest, so the most violent, for example. Or you might achieve status or be slightly higher up than people at the bottom because you can take loads of drugs. So you might turn to these kind of very strange things, but within certain groups you would gain status for it. So again, it would be based on youth subcultures, because adults generally wouldn't be impressed with people who were the most violent. But in youth, these kind of things do happen, where people kind of get known for being like really violent, or being sort of able to drink loads, or somebody who's particularly stupid when they're drunk or on drugs or something like that. And you create a status amongst your peers. And the reason why you create this alternative status hierarchy is because you can't achieve in the normal hierarchy. So you become frustrated at your situation, so you then create a new hierarchy. And this can sometimes lead to crime. So young people don't have sort of normal jobs and normal status like everybody else in society, so they create different levels of status. So this could be through things like drugs, violence, any kind of deviant behaviour. So, as it says here, when you have an alternative status hierarchy, you reject mainstream norms and values. This can often be achieved in a delinquent subculture. So I'd like you to just write down some ideas of delinquent subcultures and how they achieved status. So ones that we've looked at before. If you want to pause the clip just for a couple of minutes to have a little think, and then I'll tell you some answers in a minute. Okay, so some delinquent subcultures you might want to think of are things like, punks. So they might have achieved their status through their clothing. So what could be the most radical clothing? You might have looked at skinheads, and the way that they achieve their status is through violence. You could have used any really, but teddy boys, they might have achieved their status through looking the most pristine. So any of those would be fine. So it's the idea that you're going to be creating a status through something which is breaking the norms and values. So punks' clothing broke the norms and values. Skinheads were violence, which was obviously breaking the norms and values as well. So the reason why people do this in their youth is because they can't achieve status in conventional ways. Okay, so the next theory is Marxist subcultural explanations. And actually, it's quite easy. It's the same theorists that we've looked at before, but all you need to do is link to how they were deviant. So Cohen talked about skinheads, so now you just need to link to how skinheads were violent, for example. So that's your deviant element. And then the teddy boys, obviously, they were violent as well, but also they sort of rebelled with their clothing. Punks rebelled through their clothing and also their music. And skateboarding was kind of to do with trespassing. So this is the idea that actually all of the Marxist theories we've looked at before were actually Marxist subcultural explanations. But when you're linking it to youth crime or youth deviance, you just need to make that additional link. So to violence or to the fact that they're rebelling in their clothing or music or trespassing or any of those different things. So Marxist subcultural should be relatively easy, but you just need to maybe make something in your notes which says that we use the same theories, but we then just link it to the deviant activities they were engaged in. And all of it, obviously, because they're Marxists, it was because they were rebelling against capitalism and the class system. So I'm running out of space. Okay. So, left realism is slightly different because we haven't covered this before. So, left realism, they're very similar to Marxists, but the reason why they're called realists is because they're a little bit more realistic about the reasons why youth will turn to crime or deviance. So, they don't necessarily say that it's because of rebellion against capitalism or anything like this. They say that it's because of three factors. They are relative deprivation, marginalisation and subculture. So if you have a little look on page 64 in your textbook, it will tell you what these three things are. So if you make some notes on that, and then I'll explain it in a minute. Okay, so relative deprivation, to start off with, is when you feel deprived compared to somebody else. So it's not actually about being like hugely deprived or anything, so being in absolute poverty, but it's about being deprived compared to somebody else. So this is the idea that I am deprived compared to somebody who owns a 5-bedroom house because I don't own a 5-bedroom house. And with youth, they're more likely to feel relatively deprived because all their friends have iPods and iPads and new trainers and new fashion and new jewellery and all those kind of things, and they can go to festivals. And sometimes, if you're a working class youth, you are more likely to feel deprived compared to your friends than if you're a middle or an upper class youth. This then makes you feel marginalised. We know what marginalisation is because we've talked about it in terms of feminism. But this is the idea again, working class youth are more likely to feel marginalised, so pushed to the margins of society, felt like outcasts in society because they don't have the money to be able to feel included within society. What they then do is they form subcultures. Everything we've been looking at has been to do with subcultures. And what Lee and Young believe is that when they're in those subcultures, they might then turn to deviant activity. And this could include anything such as being violent, graffiti, vandalism, any of those kind of things that could be linked to deviance. But apparently this is all fundamentally to do with the fact that working class youth feel deprived in their situation, they feel marginalised, they feel pushed to the edges of society, and so they're forced into subcultures where they will be deviant. So very, very similar to Marxism, except left realists don't really focus on capitalism so much. They just focus on the fact that our economic system leads to relative deprivation. Okay, so labelling theory, so this is again going to be quite easy. So it's the idea that if you're negatively labelled by the media, then it's going to lead you to deviance. And we've already talked about deviancy amplification, which is the idea that the media, amplification, my pen stopped working, sorry. So deviancy amplification, which is the idea that the media actually amplify deviance, so they increase deviance by the way that they present certain youth. So if you remember, Stan Cohen was talking about the mods and rockers, Forbert was talking about the hoodies, Osgerby was about black gun crime, and Thornton and Jackson was about clubbing culture. All of these presented these different youth groups as engaging in deviant activity. So with Stan Cohen and the mods and rockers, that was violence. With the hoodies, it was theft. With Osgerby, in fact, with Forbert, it also led to violence as well, apparently. With Osgerby, that was gun crime. With Thornton and Jackson, it was drug taking. So apparently, the way that labelling theory would explain youth deviance is because it means that if youth are negatively labelled, they then live up to this label in the self-fulfilling prophecy, and then they turn to more deviance, so it increases deviance. Hopefully, again, that should be quite an easy one for you. Okay, so this is we're nearly there with this. So gender and youth crime and delinquency. So there's Hydenson in 2002 who basically said that in terms of gender, females commit fewer crimes, and this is because of the fact that they're socialised differently to men. So males are socialised to be tough, aggressive, physically strong, and females are socialised to be pretty, soft, emotional, domesticated. And so as a result, females aren't really socialised into the values which link with criminality. So if males are socialised to be tough, that might lead them to violence, which is criminal. If males are socialised to be physically strong, they might vandalise something, again, trying to show their masculinity. So it's almost the idea that our socialisation means that boys are inevitably going to commit more crime than females, because it's not like you can prove how domesticated you are with crime. It's not really something that is, I suppose, done. And so as a result, men are more likely to commit crime than women, but most often in youth. And the reason for this is because youths are more likely to care about showing their masculinity or their femininity than adults. So it's most likely going to be male youths that are committing crime because they're socialised to be tough, aggressive and physically strong, more so than adults. Also, women experience more social control, which we've talked about before with bedroom culture. So they don't commit crime because they're too busy kind of being controlled by their parents and what other people think of them. And as it says here, Campbell criticises this idea and says females commit more crimes than they are caught for. So this is kind of another idea. So Hydenson says that women do actually commit less crime because of all these reasons. But Campbell criticises it and says, well, actually, females just don't get caught as much. So females are committing just as many crimes, but they're just getting away with it more. Okay, ethnicity. So what's interesting about ethnicity is you are 4 times more likely to be arrested if you're an ethnic minority in the UK. And apparently this is due to racism. So Gilroy said that the Macpherson report shows that the police are institutionally racist, which basically means that the police practices and policies are, I suppose to some extent, unintentionally racist towards ethnic minorities. This means that they're more likely to be stopped and searched, they're more likely to be sort of harassed by the police, and so as a result, they're more likely to be arrested. Also, the media with Hall et al. Also, by the way, this is all on page 65, so if you want to read this before I talk through that, that's fine as well. So Hall et al. Said that the media creates what we call moral panics. So we've talked about moral panics before. And in the past has created a moral panic regarding the black mugging crisis, which happened in the 70s. And this was the idea that loads of black people, apparently, were going out and attacking loads of white people. But Hall et al. Was actually a Marxist and said that the real reason this moral panic was created was so the newspapers would hide the real inequalities. And those inequalities were to do with capitalism. It made them an easy, I suppose, scapegoat. It made them a person to blame and to kind of divert attention away from. And so what ended up happening is the ethnic minority groups were targeted more by the public and the police, when actually the real issue was the fact that we had a capitalist system that was unfair, there was a recession, there was loads of economic problems. But what ended up happening is the media presented black people as the devil, and so as a result they ended up being a moral panic. People were scared, and so it was more likely that the police were going to arrest black people because of this. And then Solomos went on to say that actually the white population in general are very racist. So it means that the police, the general population, the media are all racist. So it means that young black people are more likely to turn to crime either because of labelling or because of discrimination, because they feel marginalised. So either they do commit more crime because of their labels, or they're just targeted more because everybody thinks they're going to commit more crime. So it's all kind of a quite pretty bleak picture for ethnic minority youths, unfortunately. Okay, so also we've obviously looked at the rebellion against racism with Savanandan, and the fact that Gilroy said that black youth commit crime as a political response to racism, prejudice and discrimination they face in society. So it's the idea if they've experienced all this racism, they might rebel because of it. And also it says that it's a kind of political response. It's like, I don't care about you white people, you've oppressed me, you've been racist towards me, so now I'm going to commit crime against you. So the final thing we're going to look at is the impact of gang culture on deviance and crime. So youth groups who aim to control a geographical area or territory is the definition of a gang. So most gangs, as it says here, are male, poor, urban, is linked to boredom, and they create an alternative status hierarchy. So as you can see, everything we've looked at so far in this PowerPoint would link to gangs because they're male, so Hydinson would explain the fact that it's because they're socialised in that way. They're poor, so that would be explained by left realism, Marxist subcultural and functionalist subcultural. Urban, which again could be linked to left realism, so if you live in an area which is poor and sort of you live quite near to somewhere where it's rich, so it might mean that you feel relatively deprived. Linked to boredom, so this is the idea that you don't necessarily have anything to do, you don't have any status, and as it says here, it creates an alternative status hierarchy, so you don't have any normal status, anything that you're doing, and so as a result, you want to create an alternative status hierarchy. So a critique of this, however, is Kearney in 1998, who said that there was an increased number of girl gangs due to less social control. So all the gangs that we talked about before, as I said, were linked to being male, but Kearney says that actually there's more girl gangs. However, Rutter, Giller and Hagel suggest that girl gangs in the UK have been exaggerated by the media, although they do have more opportunities to commit crime now than they did in the past due to fewer bedroom cultures. So this is the idea that, this is kind of our postmodernist idea, the idea that actually girls do have a lot more choice, a lot more freedom, and so as a result of having this kind of more choice and more freedom, it means that they're more likely to join girl gangs. And if you remember, We've looked at girl gangs before with Archer, so you could use that to support this as well. So here's 2 past exam questions just to kind of show you why we've been doing this PowerPoint. So assess the view that most subcultures are associated with deviance. This one came up last year. So to some extent, you probably won't have it come up again, but either way, the way that you would answer this is you would say, yes, most subcultures are deviant, and you would give examples of the teddy boys and skinheads and punks and all those kind of things, and then you could give explanations for that, so any of the explanations we've just been talking about. And then you could critique it and say, well, actually, a number of subcultures aren't deviant. So you could say, there's teeny bop culture, there's bedroom culture, there's new wave girls, but then you could also use your postmodernist ideas that actually subcultures no longer exist, and that actually to say that subcultures are deviant is not necessarily true, because now what we have instead are neo-tribes and hybrid subcultures instead, or hybrid identities. So hopefully that would be quite an easy question, but it's a bit of a shame that it came up last year. But other questions which haven't been asked, something like outline and explain why subcultures are often seen as deviant. So you just literally give 3 peers saying why subcultures are deviant. So you could use your left realism for one, you could use your Marxist for another, you could use your subcultural explanation for another, and just make sure that you give examples of subcultures which would be deviant. So if you want to give those questions a go, you can, I'll mark them, but we will be talking about this when we get back to make sure that everyone was okay with it. So hopefully that was relatively easy to understand. It is in your book on page 63 to 66, so if you want to have a look through those in a bit more detail, you can, and also obviously ask me any questions on the Facebook group if you have any. Right, see you in a couple of weeks.
Made with Doodlecast Pro.